Welcome to Dad's Revenge, where quiet men prove that patience is a strength. Each story here is about a father who is underestimated, disrespected, or betrayed by the very people who should be protecting him, and how that father finds his own way to mend things. Welcome to today's story. $600. That's what my son told the whole town I stole from my own granddaughter right there on the blessing platform in front of every boat I'd ever built a name on. Dad, if you took it and don't remember, we can fix that, but lying makes it worse, Angelo said, loud enough for the cameras behind him. I hadn't touched that jacket in 3 hours. 44 years in this business taught me to ask for proof before I ask for forgiveness, so I did. The platform stood at the edge of the town dock, strung with ribbon and pine boughs for the blessing, and every workboat in Deal Island rode at anchor behind it, hulls painted and scrubbed for the one morning a year the whole community stood still together. 200 people had gathered to watch the minister bless the fleet. Instead, they watched Deputy Rhea Santos step up beside my son, with her hand resting near her radio and her eyes moving from his face to mine. "Mr. Murray," she said to me, "your son says an envelope with $600 in it went missing from his house yesterday. Fundraiser money, his daughter's." "Scout science trip," Angelo said before I could answer, "for the coastal ecology program. Dad had dinner with us last night. This morning the envelope was gone, and half an hour ago I found it in his jacket pocket, hanging by our back door." I looked at the crowd instead of at him. Isabel stood near the platform steps with both arms crossed tight against her chest, watching her husband the way a person watches a stove they aren't sure they turned off. Scout stood a few feet from her mother, still and pale, saying nothing yet. "I wore a jacket to your house last night," I said. "It's hanging on the rail of my skiff right now, still damp from the crossing this morning. I haven't set foot near your back door since I left your kitchen." Rhea Santos followed where I pointed. 40 yards down the dock, my tan rain slicker lay folded over the rail exactly where I'd left it before I climbed onto the platform, salt water still darkening the collar. She studied it a long moment, then looked back at the dark canvas coat Angelo held pinched between two fingers like it carried a disease. "That's not the jacket he's talking about," Angelo said. "That's yours from the boat. The one with the money in it is the wool one you keep at our house for winter. You've worn it for years." "I know exactly which coat you mean," I said. "And I know I haven't worn it since Sunday supper 3 weeks ago." A murmur moved through the crowd the way wind moves through marsh grass before you feel it on your face. Somewhere behind the deputy, a young man from the county paper lifted a camera and angled it toward me, not toward Angelo, as if the town's newspaper had already decided which of us made the better photograph for tomorrow's front page. $600 is a specific number, Rhea said mostly to herself, writing something in a small notebook. "Where was the envelope kept before it went missing?" "Scout's desk drawer," Angelo said. "She counted it Friday night. I found it this morning." "Did anyone else have access to that room?" "My father visits every week. He knows the house better than some of my own crew." I let that sit in the salt air without answering it. 44 years of running a picking house had taught me that a man who rushes to fill silence is usually the one with something crowding his mouth. I had nothing crowding mine. I had a boat 40 yards away with a wet coat on its rail, and I had a granddaughter standing close enough to hear every word, saying nothing. "Mr. Murray," Rhea said, turning back to me, "can you account for your morning before you arrived at the platform?" I left my house at first light, worked the culling tables at the shed until 8, then walked straight here. Alone. My crew was with me until 7:30. After that, alone. Angelo's jaw tightened at that answer, the way a man's jaw tightens when the truth doesn't land where he expected it to. He glanced once toward the reporter's camera, then back to Rhea, and something in the shift of his eyes reminded me of a boy I had once watched lie about a broken porch lamp with the exact same practiced calm.
"There's a jacket with $600 of a 13-year-old's fundraiser money sitting somewhere in this town,"
Rhea said loud enough now for the front rows to hear. "And 2 coats being pointed at from 2 different directions. Before this goes any further, I want both jackets in front of me, together." The crowd had gone quiet in the particular way a crowd goes quiet when it senses the story is about to turn. Angelo still held the dark wool coat pinched between his fingers, refusing to set it down. My own jacket sat 40 yards away on the rail of a boat that had never been near his back door. Somewhere close to her mother, I saw Scout finally lift her chin the way her grandmother Elizabeth used to lift hers whenever fear and courage arrived in the same breath, and open her mouth to speak. Rhea turned toward Scout and lowered her voice the way adults do when they remember almost too late that a child is standing in the middle of an argument built for grown men. "You're Scout. Is that right? Angelo's daughter?" Scout nodded once her hands pressed flat against the front of her sweatshirt, as if she were holding something in place. "Grandpa didn't wear that coat today. I saw Dad carry it in from the shed before Grandpa even got to the platform. He hung it on the nail by the picking room door himself." Angelo's mouth opened before she finished the sentence. "She's mixed up. She was setting up her science rack in the shed this morning. She wasn't paying attention to anything but her seedlings." "I was paying attention," Scout said, "because you told me not to knock the tablet off the shelf while you were in there. You said it twice." A silence followed that felt heavier than the one before it, the kind that settles over a dock the way fog settles over marsh grass, slow and complete. Isabel's arms unfolded from her chest, and for a moment her hand hovered near her daughter's shoulder without quite landing, as though she wasn't certain whose side her own body had already decided to take. "Honey," Angelo said, softer now. The tone people use with someone they're trying to walk back from a ledge. "You were focused on your project. You weren't watching the door." "I was watching the door," Scout said, "because that's where the morning light comes in for the rack. I check it every day before school. I know exactly what time you came through it, and I know you didn't come through it empty-handed." I had helped her build that rack myself, out of scrap cedar from the shed back in the spring, when she first brought home the assignment. I remembered telling her that light didn't lie the way people sometimes did, that if she watched it carefully enough every morning, it would always tell her exactly what time it was, and exactly what it had seen. I hadn't expected the lesson to matter to anyone but a row of bean seedlings. Rhea wrote something else in her notebook, unhurried. And I understood then that a deputy's silence could carry more weight than any question she might have asked out loud. She looked up at Angelo. "Do you want to respond to what your daughter just told me?" "I want this documented as an ongoing family matter," Angelo said, "not settled on a public dock by a 13-year-old with a science project." "It's documented either way," Rhea said. "Whether it's settled is a different question, and it isn't mine to answer today. I'll need statements from everyone here who can speak to this morning. That includes you, Mr. Murray, and it includes Scout when her mother's present for it." The crowd had thinned by then, the way a crowd thins once it senses the interesting part of a story has passed and the paperwork part has begun. The county reporter lowered his camera, but kept the strap looped around his wrist, still watching. Past the last row of onlookers near the parking gravel, I noticed two men in pressed shirts I didn't recognize standing apart from the fishermen and their families, their attention fixed on the platform in a way that had nothing to do with blessings or boats. Rhea closed her notebook and told us an investigator would likely follow up within the week, and that nothing connected to either jacket or the envelope should be discarded or altered in the meantime. She thanked Scout for speaking up gently the way she might have thanked a witness twice her age, and then walked back toward her cruiser. The crowd finished dispersing around her boat by boat, family by family, until the platform stood nearly empty except for the four of us and the ribbons still lifting in the wind off the Sound. I thought standing there of how Elizabeth used to say that truth rarely needed defending, only enough silence around it to be heard. I had given Angelo that silence all morning. He had filled it with everything except an answer. Scout hadn't raised her voice once through any of it. She hadn't pointed a finger or looked to me for rescue. She had simply told the deputy what her own eyes had shown her, the same steady way her grandmother used to deliver bad news at the kitchen table, without drama and without apology, because the truth didn't need either one to be true. Angelo waited until the cruiser had backed out of the lot before he spoke again. "You humiliated me in front of this whole town," he said, and for a moment I thought he might be speaking to his daughter. Then he turned toward me instead. I didn't call the deputy, I said. You did that yourself before you had a single fact to stand on. Because $600 went missing, and because you needed witnesses to see it happen your way. Isabel said his name, quiet, almost a warning, but he didn't look at her. His jaw had the same tightness it carried on the platform, the tightness of a man recalculating in real time. Scout stood a step behind her mother now, watching her father with an expression I couldn't read, somewhere between fear and something steadier than fear. "This isn't over," Angelo said, reaching into the canvas bag slung over his shoulder, the same bag he'd carried onto the platform that morning. He pulled out a black folder I hadn't noticed until then, its corner marked with a strip of yellow tape. "This is exactly why we need to talk," he said, setting it flat on the tailgate of his truck. "Not out here, somewhere private." Angelo didn't wait for me to answer. He climbed into his truck and drove the half-mile to his own house without another word, and I followed in mine because a folder with yellow tape on the corner wasn't something I could let sit unread. Isabel rode with Scout in the truck behind me. Nobody spoke over the radio between the dock and the driveway. He set the folder on the kitchen island the way a man sets down something he's proud of squaring its edges to the counter's edge before he opened it. "This is exactly why we need temporary safeguards in place," he said. "No accusations, no drama. You let me handle financial decisions for 90 days. You get evaluated by a specialist, and we keep this whole thing out of the company." I looked down at the first page. It called itself a Family Management Agreement, printed on heavy stock, the kind of paper meant to look serious before anyone had read a word of it. The third paragraph granted Angelo an irrevocable proxy over every voting share I held in Murray Seafood Works. The fourth authorized him to negotiate the sale of company property without further approval from me. I read it twice, looking for the word temporary anywhere past the heading. It wasn't there. "You had this drawn up before the money went missing," I said. "My attorney drew it up because I've been worried about you for months. Your attorney knew you were going to accuse me of stealing from your own daughter." His jaw tightened again, the same small pull near his eye I'd watched since he was a boy, standing over a broken lamp insisting the cat had done it. "Those are two separate matters," he said. "No," I said. "They're the same matter. I just don't know yet how deep it runs." "You're not making sense, Dad. This is exactly what worries me. You stand here talking about how deep something runs like there's a conspiracy against you, when all I'm trying to do is keep this family and this company from coming apart over a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding doesn't come with a document already printed and waiting on your kitchen counter." Angelo's eyes flicked toward Isabel, as if he expected her to back him up, and when she said nothing, something shifted in his face, small and quick, gone before I could name it. "It's called being prepared," he said, his voice quieter now, groping for a word that might land the way logic hadn't. "I planned ahead. That's called being responsible. It's something you taught me." "I taught you to plan for storms and slow seasons," I said. "Not for accusing your own father in front of 200 witnesses." Isabel stood near the refrigerator, with her arms crossed again, watching the folder, more than either of us saying nothing. Scout had gone quiet in the doorway, her eyes moving from her father to me and back, the way a person watches a rope to see which way it's about to pull taut. "I'm not signing this today," I said, closing the folder. "Not today, and likely not any day until I understand what 90 days is actually meant to buy you. It's meant to protect the company from you making a mistake while you're not thinking clearly." "I've never thought more clearly in my life than I did on that platform this morning." He didn't answer that. I picked up my keys from where I'd set them on the counter and looked at Scout still standing in the doorway, chin raised, the way her grandmother used to raise hers. "You did the right thing today," I told her. Angelo stepped half a pace between us, not quite blocking the words, but close enough that I understood the message underneath it. I didn't argue. I only nodded once to Isabel, took the black folder off the island without asking, and walked out to my truck. I drove home along the causeway with the folder on the seat beside me, the marsh grass burning gold on either side in the late afternoon light, herons lifting off the flats as my tires passed, and I didn't turn on the radio. My house sat at the north end of the island, a half-mile past the last of the picking houses, close enough to hear the gulls working the shallows at low tide. Elizabeth had planted the crepe myrtles along the drive the year Angelo turned 8, insisting they'd be worth the wait, even though neither of us would live to see them at their full height. They were taller than the roofline now, and their branches had started to arch together over the gravel like a doorway. I let myself in, set my keys in the same ceramic dish by the door I'd used for 40 years, and hung the tan slicker on its peg, still damp at the collar. Then I sat down at the kitchen table across from the chair that had been Elizabeth's, and I laid the folder open between us the way I might have laid it open for her once, back when she was still the one who caught the things I missed before I saw them myself. "He planned this," I said to the empty chair, because speaking it aloud to a room that couldn't argue back was sometimes the only honest conversation left available to a man in my position. Grief hadn't made me foolish. It had only ever made me quieter and quiet. I had learned that morning was easy for people to mistake for confusion, especially people who had never once had to sit alone at a table with nothing but the truth for company. I had been sitting at that table for the better part of an hour, the folder still open in front of me, turning the same 3 facts over the way a man turns a stone in his pocket, looking for the edge that would finally cut something loose. The house was quiet in the particular way it had been quiet every evening since Elizabeth died, a quiet that had never once in 3 years started to feel like peace. The phone on the kitchen wall rang at 4:26, the old ring, the one that still startled me even after 40 years of hearing it in that exact spot. I almost let it go to the machine. Something in the second ring made me pick it up instead. "Grandpa." Scout's voice came through, barely louder than breath, close to the receiver, the way a person speaks when they don't want to be overheard in their own house. "Are you all right?" I asked. "I'm okay. I'm using Mom's old phone. It only works on the house Wi-Fi, so Dad doesn't know I have it." "Where's your father?" "Downstairs. He and Mom are arguing. I don't have long." I kept my voice as even as I could manage. "All right. Tell me. You remember my science camera, the one on the tripod by the rack?" I did. She'd been working on it for 6 weeks, a project on how different light exposures affected bean seedlings, and I'd helped her set the tripod at the right height so it wouldn't catch shadows off the shelf. An old tablet borrowed from her school took a photograph every 30 seconds from 6 in the morning until noon, uploading each one automatically to keep a full record for her report. She'd chosen the shed for the setup because the morning sun came through the side window at just the right angle, and I remembered thinking when she showed me the tripod that it was the kind of quiet, patient project only a certain kind of child ever finished. "It was running this morning," Scout said. "Before the platform, before any of it." My hand tightened around the receiver. "Did you look at it?" "Only some of it. Dad came into the shed around 8:45, carrying your coat over his arm. He stood right in front of the seedling rack, right where the camera points. I saw him put something blue in the inside pocket. Then he hung the coat on the nail by the door and left." I closed my eyes and made myself breathe before I answered. "Scout, listen to me carefully. Do not confront your father about this. Do not try to take the tablet out of the house. If your mother or father asks you a direct question, don't lie to them. Do you understand?" "I understand." "Is the recording saved anywhere besides the tablet itself?" "It uploads to the shared garden album automatically. You're still in it, remember? You helped me set up the account back in the spring, so you could see the seedlings too." I remembered accepting that invitation weeks ago, mostly out of politeness, and scrolling past a handful of photographs of pale green shoots pushing up through dark soil. I had commented on the first true leaf the way any grandfather might. I had never imagined the same folder would hold something like this. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "Now put the phone back exactly where you found it and don't touch that tablet again tonight." "Are you going to show the police that?" "I'm going to make sure the truth is protected. That's all you need to carry right now." "Dad said you might go to jail." Her voice cracked slightly on the word jail, the first crack I'd heard in it all day. "Your father said a great many things today," I told her, "because he's frightened of something, and frightened people say things to make the fear belong to someone else instead." "Frightened of what?" It was exactly the right question, and I didn't have the answer yet. "I'm going to find out," I said.
That's my job tonight. Yours is just to stay calm and stay quiet.
I heard a floorboard creak somewhere on her end, faint through the receiver, and her breathing changed quicker now. "I have to go," she whispered. "Grandpa, I really did see him carry it in. I know you didn't do it."
"I know you did," I said. "Go on now." The line went dead before I could say anything else. I sat at the table for a long moment with the receiver still in my hand, listening to the dial tone, the way a person listens to silence after a door closes somewhere in another room. Then I set it down, walked to the small desk in the hallway where Elizabeth had once kept the household accounts, and opened the laptop she'd bought me 2 Christmases before she died. The one I still used mostly for weather reports and the company's online ordering system. She had taught me how to use half of what was on that machine, patiently, the way she'd once taught our stock boys to run a register without losing count under pressure. I hadn't opened the laptop in longer than I wanted to admit, and the screen took a moment to remember me asking for a password I had to type twice before my hands settled. I typed in the address for the shared garden album Scout had set up back in the spring. My fingers slower on the keys than I would have liked, and waited for the page to load. The cursor blinking against a white screen that felt for a few seconds like the last calm thing left in the house. The album opened slowly, the way anything on that laptop tended to load, and then the thumbnails filled the screen in neat rows, hundreds of them, each one time-stamped in the corner, the way Scout's teacher had required for the report. I scrolled back to the earliest hour of the morning and began working forward, frame by frame, the way I would have gone through a stack of invoices looking for the one number that didn't belong. At 8:41, the shed stood empty except for the seedling rack and a stripe of early sun crossing the concrete floor. At 8:43, Angelo appeared through the open shed door, my charcoal coat draped over one arm, exactly the way Scout had described it. At 8:44, he stood with his back partly turned to the tablet, his shoulder blocking most of the frame. The next several images showed his right hand disappearing into the coat's inside pocket. Then, in one frame, a corner of blue fabric appeared between his fingers. By 8:46, he had pushed the envelope fully into the pocket and pressed the coat flat with both palms, smoothing it the way a man smooths a bedsheet he wants to look undisturbed. In the final frame before he turned to leave, his face angled directly toward the tablet for less than a second, close enough that I could read the tightness around his mouth, even in a photograph taken from 10 feet away. He hadn't noticed the camera. Nobody ever does when they believe they're alone. I sat back from the screen for a moment, not because I doubted what I'd seen, but because I wanted to be certain I wasn't reading anger into a picture that only held fact. 44 years of running a business had taught me that evidence was strongest when nobody could accuse you of improving it, so I copied the full sequence onto 2 separate flash drives without cropping a single image or changing a single file name, and set both drives in the ceramic dish by the door next to my keys. Elizabeth used to say that grief made a person either careless or exact, never anything in between. And I understood then which direction 3 years alone had pushed me. I had become a man who backed up evidence twice before he'd even decided what to do with it. It was on the third pass through the sequence, checking timestamps against each other the way I'd check a delivery log against an invoice, that I noticed something past Angelo's shoulder in the 8:43 frame. Through the open shed door, faint in the background, 2 men in pressed shirts were visible on the dock beyond, walking toward the blessing platform a full hour before the ceremony began. I recognized them then. I'd seen those same 2 shirts standing apart from the fishermen that morning, watching the platform with an attention that had nothing to do with boats. I picked up the phone and called Sophia Faulkner. She had been our family's attorney for 26 years, sharp as broken glass, and one of the few people who had never once softened her voice around me after Elizabeth died. "What happened?" she asked before I'd said more than her name. I told her everything, start to finish, the platform, the deputy scout's phone call, the photographs. She didn't interrupt until I reached the part about the 2 men on the dock. "Did you sign anything at Angelo's house?" she asked. "No." "But you have the agreement itself." "I took it off the counter when I left. It's on my kitchen table right now." "Good. That's better than I hoped for.
Send me the photographs tonight, along with the agreement and anything else connected to the property sale he mentioned. Don't call him back and don't go to his house again until I've had a chance to look at all of it." "There's something else," I said. "Those two men on the dock, I think they were there for the resort group. The ones who've been asking about buying the pier." Sophia was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. The kind of quiet I recognized from her, the sound of a mind working faster than a voice could keep up with. "Walker," she said, "the Blessing platform draws every family on this island in one place, and it also happens to be the one morning of the year outsiders come looking at waterfront property without anyone thinking twice about strangers on the dock." "You think he planned the timing around them?" "I think a man doesn't stage a public accusation on the busiest morning of the season by accident," she said. "Not when he needs the whole town and a set of investors watching him take control before anyone asks a single question about the numbers underneath it." I looked down at the folder still open on my table, at the paragraph granting Angelo authority to negotiate the sale of company property without my approval, and felt something colder than anger settle into my chest. This had never been only about $600, and it had never only been about me. "What do I do about the coat?" I asked. "The one Angelo's holding as evidence." "Nothing tonight. Don't touch it, don't ask him to hand it over, and don't let the deputy's investigator hear that you've gone looking for it yourself. I'll arrange for a digital specialist to preserve the album with its original file data first thing tomorrow, before anyone can claim later that the timestamps were altered. That protects Scout's account better than anything either of us could say on her behalf. And the agreement, the proxy, keep it exactly where it is. Don't sign it, don't destroy it, and don't give him any reason to think you've shown it to anyone yet." She paused, and I heard her flipping through something on her end papers, or a calendar, the sound of a mind already 3 moves ahead. "Send me everything tonight," she said again. "And Walker, don't underestimate how far he's willing to let this go to get what's underneath all of it." After I hung up with Sophia, I didn't go to bed. I went instead to the small office off the hallway, the room Elizabeth had always called my thinking room, and pulled the company's quarterly financial packet down from the shelf where it had sat for 3 weeks, its corners already soft from how many times I'd already turned through it before any of this began. I hadn't told anyone I'd started reading it that closely. A man doesn't announce that he's begun questioning his own son's numbers, not until he's certain the questioning is fair. But 3 weeks earlier, going through the packet the way I did every quarter, out of habit more than necessity, I'd found a line item that didn't sit right. A payment to a company called Union Point Advisory Group, $38,500, and then a second payment 2 months later for $61,200, both described only as strategic consulting services. No hours listed, no deliverables named, no consultant identified anywhere in the file. I opened the packet again, now under the kitchen light, and traced every payment to that same name across 18 months of records. By the time I finished adding the column by hand, twice to be certain the number wasn't a trick of my own tired eyes, it came to $792,000. I had never once heard of Union Point Advisory Group before that first line item caught my attention. Neither, as it turned out, 3 weeks ago, had our own controller. I remembered the conversation clearly because it had unsettled me enough to keep the packet on that shelf instead of filing it away. I'd asked Eliezer Newton, who had kept our books straight for 9 years with the same quiet precision Elizabeth once brought to the register, whether he had the underlying contract for Union Point's engagement. He told me Angelo had it. When I asked Angelo the same question the following week, he told me Eliezer had it. 2 men pointing at each other over a piece of paper is rarely a filing error. In business, it usually means the document doesn't exist, or it says something neither man wants seen in daylight. I had let the matter sit after that, the way a person lets a suspicious mole sit for a season, before finally going to the doctor, telling myself it was probably nothing, that Angelo had earned the benefit of the doubt a dozen times over across 20 years of good decisions. I had asked him once, gently, to slow down on a proposed sale of one of our smaller lease parcels until I'd had time to review the consulting payments properly. He'd agreed, on the surface, and I'd let 3 weeks pass without pressing harder, because pressing harder had felt at the time like an accusation I wasn't ready to make against my own son. I told myself that was patience. I understand now it was closer to cowardice wearing patience's coat, and that a man can go on calling avoidance by a kinder name for exactly as long as the cost of it hasn't come due. Sitting at that table now, with a folder demanding my voting shares open on one side and $792,000 of unexplained payments open on the other, I understood how badly that gentleness had cost me. Grief hadn't made me careless with numbers. It had made me careless with the courage to act on what the numbers were already telling me. Eliezer had never once given me reason to doubt him in 9 years. He was the kind of man who drove 40 minutes out of his way once to return an accidental overpayment to a supplier who hadn't even noticed the error himself, and Elizabeth had trusted him with the books before I ever fully understood what trusting a controller meant. If he was protecting Angelo, it wasn't out of greed. It would be out of fear, and fear was a harder thing to reason with than greed ever was, because fear didn't care what was true. It only cared what felt survivable. I picked up the phone once more, close to 9 at night, and called the shed office directly, hoping Eliezer might still be finishing the evening tally the way he sometimes did on a Sunday before the Monday delivery trucks arrived. The line rang 4 times before it went to the machine, his voice recorded years ago, steadier than I imagined his hands would be if he heard what I was about to ask him. I didn't leave a message. Some conversations needed a face across the table, not a voicemail a person could rehearse an answer to overnight. I closed the packet, squared its edges against the folder beside it, the way Angelo had squared his own papers on the kitchen island hours earlier, and decided I would drive to the shed myself, first thing in the morning, before the crew arrived, before Angelo had any reason to expect me there. I sat a while longer at the table, listening to the house settle the way old houses do after dark, the particular creak in the hallway floor that Elizabeth used to say was the wood remembering the day. $792,000 did not vanish quietly into any company's books. It went somewhere specific to someone specific for a reason specific enough that 2 grown men would rather point fingers at each other than say its name out loud. I thought of Elizabeth's brass name tag from our first store, still kept in a red tin on the highest shelf of her sewing room. The one that read co-owner instead of wife of the owner, because she had refused once to let a banker address every question only to me. She had built this company on the belief that the people who did the real work deserved to be seen clearly for it, good and bad both. I owed her. And I owed 91 employees who trusted their paychecks to a name over the door the same clarity now, whatever it cost the family to get there. I meant to find out exactly where. I was pulling my truck keys from the ceramic dish, still planning to catch Eliezer before the crew arrived, when a car I didn't recognize turned into my drive at 12 minutes past 8. A man in a gray suit stepped out of place against the marsh and the crepe myrtles, carrying a thick envelope against his chest, the way a person carries something they'd rather not be holding. "Are you Walker James Murray?" he asked. "I am. I need you to sign for this." He held out a clipboard along with the envelope, and I signed without reading what I was signing the way a man signs for a delivery he hasn't ordered, but can't refuse either. My hand was steadier on the clipboard than I expected it to be, though. I couldn't have said afterward whether that steadiness came from calm or from the particular numbness that arrives just before a person understands how much trouble they're actually in. He was back in his car and turning out of the drive before I'd even broken the seal. The morning was warm already. Gulls working the shallows past the tree line, the way they did every day, whether or not a man's life happened to be unraveling on his own front step. And I remember thinking absurdly that I should have offered the process server a glass of water before he drove off, the way Elizabeth would have insisted I do for anyone who came up our drive, even one carrying news like this. I opened it standing right there in the gravel, because whatever it was, it hadn't waited for me to get comfortable first. Inside was an emergency petition filed that morning in the county probate court. My son was asking a judge to declare me incompetent to manage my own affairs. The petition ran 41 pages, and I made myself read every one of them standing up, the way a man reads bad news he isn't ready to sit down for. It described a widower who had recently withdrawn from friends who repeated questions, who misplaced important documents, who had resisted sound business decisions, and accused loyal employees of hiding records that didn't exist. Most alarming of all, the petition said, he had taken $600 from his own granddaughter's fundraiser and concealed it inside his coat. I recognized almost nothing of myself in those pages, and recognized everything of the son who had written them. The same careful, methodical build of a case I'd once watched him bring to a bank loan officer, back when building a careful case had still been something to be proud of. I did not let myself think, standing there, about how many of his childhood report cards I had framed for exactly that same careful thoroughness, or whether some of what I had once praised in him as diligence had simply been waiting all along for a use I never imagined. My son had written that I might harm myself, my family, or the company if I wasn't granted immediate supervision. Attached was a proposed order naming Angelo my emergency guardian, with authority to exercise my voting shares while the case remained pending. The hearing was set for Friday morning. Beneath that date in smaller print was a second date I recognized instantly. The Monday following the day the board had tentatively scheduled to vote on the resort group's offer for the pier. 2 dates, 4 days apart. One of them meant to strip me of my voice at the company before the other one ever arrived. I read that part 3 times before it fully landed, the way a cold fact sometimes needs a moment to travel the whole distance from the eyes to the chest. At the bottom of the final page, above a line for the attorney of record, was a signature I didn't recognize, Parker Cortez, printed neatly beneath a scrawl that looked pressed harder into the paper than the rest of the document, as if the pen had been gripped a little too tightly at the exact moment it needed to be steadiest. I called Sophia before I'd finished reading the last page, my voice steadier on the phone than I felt standing in my own driveway. She arrived within the hour, still in the same jacket she'd worn the day before, and sat with me at the kitchen table while I made coffee. Neither of us touched. She'd driven straight from her office, she said, without stopping to finish the coffee already cooling in her own cup at home, because a probate filing with a Friday hearing date didn't leave room for a leisurely morning on either side of the phone call. She read slowly, methodically, the way she read everything, flipping back twice to compare pages against each other before moving forward. I watched her face rather than the document, because 30 years of reading contracts had taught her to keep her expression flat right up until the moment something stopped being flat on its own. I had seen that same stillness on her once before, years ago, the afternoon she'd walked into this same kitchen to tell Elizabeth and me that a supplier's contract we'd trusted for a decade had a clause buried on its 9th page that would have cost us our lease on the town dock if we'd ever missed a single payment by so much as a day. She had that look now. Near the back of the petition, on a page I hadn't paid particular attention to on my own read-through, she went still. Her eyes moved once across the page, then back to the top of it, then across again, the way a person rereads a number they're certain must be wrong. Sophia, she didn't answer right away. She set the page down flat on the table, turned it so I could see it clearly, and pressed one finger against a line near the bottom. A notary's stamp and a date, without saying a single word yet about what it meant. "Walker, look at this." Sophia turned the notary page fully toward me, her fingers still pressed beneath the stamped date. Angelo swore every fact in this petition was true under oath before a notary at 4:12 in the afternoon, Friday. I looked at the date, then looked at her, not yet understanding why her face had gone the color it had. That's the day before the platform. That's exactly my point. The alleged theft happened Sunday morning at the blessing ceremony. He signed this Friday afternoon swearing to facts about a theft that, according to his own timeline, hadn't happened yet. I read the notarization block again myself, certain I'd misunderstood something, the way a person rereads a bank statement, hoping the number will have quietly corrected itself. It hadn't. Friday afternoon, 2 full days before Scout ever stood on that platform and told a deputy what she'd seen from the shed doorway. I thought of Scout's small, steady voice on the platform, how certain she'd sounded. How little she'd known that her own father had already sworn a story to a notary before she ever opened her mouth to tell hers.
He could claim the notary misdated it, I said, or that the specific allegations were added to the document later, after the date was already stamped.
He could claim either of those things, Sophia said, and either one would only trade one problem for two others. A notary who misdates a sworn filing has her own license to worry about, and she'll remember exactly which afternoon she stamped a document this thick. And if the specific allegations were added after the notarization, that means somebody altered a sworn filing after the fact, which is a different kind of trouble entirely, the kind that follows an attorney's name around for the rest of his career. She paused a moment, tapping her pen once against the table's edge. I've watched Parker Cortez argue 3 cases against me. He's careful. He double-checks dates the way some men double-check locks. If there's an error here, my instinct says it isn't his.
You think Angelo gave him bad information?
I think a good attorney trusts his client's account of events right up until the moment the paperwork stops matching the calendar. Whether Parker knew about this discrepancy when he filed it, or whether Angelo handed him a timeline that was already wrong, is something we may not know until this goes further than either of us wants it to. She was already photographing each page with her phone, methodically, unhurried, the same way she'd once walked our own store aisles counting fixtures for an insurance claim after a hurricane, refusing to let urgency turn into carelessness. "I'm going to call the clerk's office," she said, "and request the electronic filing history. Every document system logs when a file is uploaded, when it's revised, and by whom. If this petition went through more than one version before it was filed this morning, there will be a record of it, whether Parker Cortez wants there to be or not." "You think there were multiple versions?" "I think a man doesn't accidentally notarize a sworn statement about a theft 4 days before the theft occurs. Either the date is wrong, which is provable, or the content is wrong, which is also provable. There's no version of this where both things happen to be true, and nobody's responsible for it." I sat with that for a moment, watching her work, and felt something shift in my chest that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite anger. Something closer to the particular clarity that comes after a long fog finally breaks. Angelo hadn't reacted to Sunday morning. He had built Sunday morning on paper before it ever happened, the same careful way he'd once built a case for a bank loan officer, methodical and patient and entirely his own. I thought of the 2 men in pressed shirts on the dock of Angelo, squaring the folder's edges against the kitchen island counter, the way a man squares something he's rehearsed setting down more than once. Every piece I'd gathered in the last day had felt on its own like a separate small betrayal. Together, laid end to end on my own kitchen table, they no longer looked separate at all. "He's had this ready," I said, "since before Scout's money ever went missing." "That's what the date tells us," Sophia said, still photographing, not looking up. "What it doesn't tell us yet is how far back the planning actually goes, or what he needed the guardianship for, badly enough to risk forging the timeline to get it fast." She finally looked up from her phone, and her expression had settled into something harder than sympathy, something closer to resolve. "I want the electronic filing history by end of day, and Walker, I want you to think carefully tonight about anything else he's asked you to sign or approve in the last few months. Because a man who plans a false accusation this far in advance rarely stops at one document." "There's the consulting payments," I said. "Nearly $800,000 over 18 months to a company neither Eliezer nor I have ever been able to get a straight answer about." Sophia set her phone down flat on the table, giving me her full attention for the first time since she'd found the date. "Send me everything you have on that tonight as well. Every invoice, every payment record, every email that mentions the company's name. If he was willing to forge a timeline over $600, I want to know exactly what he thought $800,000 was worth protecting." Sophia left a little past 6, taking copies of everything with her, and I sat alone at the kitchen table for the better part of an hour before I finally picked up the phone and dialed Angelo's number. I told myself I was calling for information, not for a fight. I wasn't entirely sure by the third ring which one I actually wanted. The kitchen had gone dark around me while Sophia and I worked, and I hadn't bothered turning on a light, so I sat there dialing his number by the glow of the phone screen. Alone, the folder and the photographed pages still spread across the table like evidence at a trial that hadn't officially started yet. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice flat, guarded. The voice of a man who'd been expecting the call and hadn't decided yet how he wanted it to go. "Dad, I need to ask you about Union Point Advisory Group," I said, no greeting first, because I'd decided in the car earlier that greetings were a kindness I wasn't obligated to spend on him tonight. A pause brief enough that a stranger might have missed it, long enough that I didn't. "What about them?" $792,000 over 18 months. "I want to know what the company received for that money." "Strategic consulting," he said. "Market positioning work ahead of the peer negotiations. You know we've needed outside perspective on the resort offer." "I want to see the reports." "There are reports. They're in the file." "I've looked in the file, Angelo. There's no file. There are invoices with a company name on them and nothing underneath describing a single hour of work, a single meeting, a single recommendation. I want the contract. I want to know who at Union Point actually did this consulting, and I want to know why. In 18 months, I've never once heard their name mentioned in a board meeting." "That's an accounting question," he said too quickly, the words arriving before he seemed to have fully decided to say them. "You'd need to ask Eliezer where the supporting documentation is filed. I approve invoices. I don't manage the paper trail behind every vendor relationship personally." "Eliezer told me 3 weeks ago that you had the underlying contract." "Then Eliezer's misremembering, or he's covering for a filing gap on his end. I'm not going to pretend I know the exact folder something sits in. That's what a controller is for." I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to how easily that sentence had come out of him, how smoothly the responsibility had slid sideways onto a man who'd spent 9 years being careful with numbers that weren't his own to lose. "You told me 2 days ago you didn't know what I was talking about when I asked about this. Now you're telling me it's strategic consulting for the resort deal and the paperwork is somewhere in Eliezer's files? Which version am I supposed to believe?" "Both things can be true, Dad. I know generally what the engagement was for. I don't personally track every invoice detail. That's not unusual for a company our size. Our size has 91 employees and a controller who's kept clean books for 9 years. This isn't a company where $792,000 disappears into a vendor nobody can describe." Angelo's breathing changed on the other end of the line. Sharper, the sound of a man recalculating faster than his voice could keep pace with. "You're doing this because of the petition," he said. "You're trying to build a counter-narrative before Friday." "I'm doing this because I found the payments 3 weeks ago before there was any petition, before there was any accusation, before any of this started. I asked you about it then, too. You didn't have an answer then either." I could hear him moving on his end of the line now. Footsteps, a door closing somewhere behind him. The sound of a man putting distance between himself and whoever else was in the house. Isabel, most likely. Or Scout listening from somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. Silence stretched long enough that I checked the screen to be sure the call hadn't dropped. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its earlier flatness, something rawer underneath it now. "You don't understand what's riding on the peer deal. If it falls apart because you're chasing consulting invoices instead of trusting me to run this company the way I've run it for years, you're not going to like what happens to this family's finances, or to those 91 jobs you keep bringing up like a weapon." "Is that a warning?" "It's a fact. The peer sale closes in weeks, not months. I don't have time to handhold you through every line item while I'm trying to save this company from a debt problem you don't even know exists yet." I sat with that sentence longer than any of the others, because it was the first true thing he'd said to me all night, even if he hadn't meant it to sound that way. "What debt problem, Angelo?" The line went quiet again, and this time when he spoke, his voice had gone careful in a different way. The careful of a man realizing he'd said one sentence too many. "I have to go," he said. "We'll talk after the hearing."
He hung up before I could answer, and I sat there holding the receiver, turning that one sentence over the way I'd turned the numbers over an hour earlier. A debt problem I didn't even know existed yet. I intended to know it by morning. I called Dr. Jabari Fry first thing Tuesday morning before the office would normally open and left a message with his answering service marked urgent. He called back within the hour, his voice carrying the particular caution of a man who already suspects the conversation ahead of him won't be simple. I'd known Jabari for the better part of 16 years, long enough that he'd stopped treating me like a chart number sometime around the third or fourth visit, back when Elizabeth was still the one who scheduled our appointments and teased him for running behind. "Walker, what's going on? Angelo's attorney called my office yesterday requesting my file on you." "That's part of why I'm calling. There's a letter attached to a court petition signed with your name recommending temporary financial supervision on the grounds that I'm suffering from memory decline. I need to know if you wrote it." A pause stretched long enough that I heard him exhale on the other end. "I wrote a letter," he said slowly, "recommending a full cognitive evaluation because your son called my office reporting concerns about forgetfulness and confusion. That's a normal, reasonable thing for a physician to write when a family member raises a worry." "Did you write that I needed financial supervision?" "No, I didn't write that sentence, and I wouldn't have. That's not a medical recommendation. That's a legal conclusion, and it's not mine to make." I closed my eyes, standing at the kitchen counter with the phone against my ear, the coffee I'd poured 20 minutes earlier gone cold beside me. The letter in the petition says exactly that. It also leaves out something I remember clearly from my visit in June. You gave me a memory screening that day. I remember drawing a clock, naming a list of words, identifying a picture of a camel, and laughing about it afterward. You told me the results were normal for my age. "They were normal," Jabari said, without hesitation this time. "I documented that. I told your son the same thing when he called, that your screening showed no concerning deficits and that the forgetfulness he described could reasonably be attributed to grief and disrupted sleep after Elizabeth. I recommended you both consider a fuller evaluation only out of caution, the way I'd recommend it for any widower a year into significant loss. I did not write that you required supervision, and I did not omit the normal screening results from anything I sent." "Then the version in the petition isn't the letter you wrote." "It sounds like it isn't, no." His voice had gone careful, deliberate, a physician choosing each word the way a man chooses footing on unfamiliar ice. "I want to see exactly what was filed before I say anything further. But if what you're describing is accurate, then someone altered the substance of a letter I signed, and that's a serious matter for me professionally, not only for you. Can you send me your original, the one you actually wrote?" "I need to be careful here, Walker. I can preserve everything in your chart and everything connected to Angelo's request, and I already have as of this call. But I can't release protected medical information to you or anyone else without a proper signed authorization, even though it's your own record. That protects you as much as it protects me. Sophia can send me the release paperwork, and I'll have everything ready the moment it arrives, untouched, exactly as it exists in my system now. Send it to her directly if you're able. I don't want there to be any question later about who had access to it in between." "Understood. I'll also preserve the message log showing when Angelo's attorney's office called and what they specifically asked for. If someone reconstructed my letter on different letterhead or edited it after I sent it, the system will show when the file was last touched and by which account." He paused again, and when he spoke next, something had shifted in his tone, no longer purely clinical. "I'm sorry this is happening to you, Walker. Whatever's going on with your son, it isn't a medical problem, and I don't want my name used to make it look like one." "I appreciate that. One more thing. Has anyone independent evaluated you since this started? Not me. Not anyone connected to the family. Someone neutral whose findings can't be argued with later." "Not yet." "Get that done before Friday if you possibly can. Not because I doubt what my own screening showed, but because a court is going to want something more current, more formal, and entirely untouched by anyone with a reason to shade it one direction or the other."
I told him I'd have Sophia arrange it, thanked him, and ended the call, standing in the same spot I'd been standing in since the phone first rang, the cold coffee still untouched beside me. A letter with my doctor's name on it had been rebuilt to say something he'd never said, the same way a petition had been dated to describe a theft that hadn't happened yet. I thought of Elizabeth again, standing at that same counter years ago, telling me once that the cruelest lies were rarely the ones built from nothing. They were the ones built from something true, rearranged just enough to point in a direction the truth never actually pointed. 2 documents, now, both altered, both wearing someone else's authority to make a lie sound like a diagnosis. I picked up the phone one more time to call Sophia, already knowing what I was going to ask her to arrange before the sun went down. Sophia drove me to Salisbury on Wednesday morning, 40 minutes inland from the water, to a clinic on the 3rd floor of a medical building that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old carpet. The waiting room had the particular hush of places where people go to learn things about themselves they aren't certain they want to know. I sat beside Sophia in a molded plastic chair, a clipboard of intake forms balanced on my knee, and found myself printing my own name more carefully than I had in years, as if legibility itself might count toward whatever score waited on the other side of the door. Dr. Faith Orr met us at 9 and didn't waste time on pleasantries beyond a firm handshake and a clear explanation of what the day would involve. She was younger than I expected, sharp-eyed with the unhurried patience of someone who'd learned long ago that rushing a mind through an evaluation only muddied the results. The testing ran nearly 5 hours. I repeated lists of words back to her first immediately, then again 20 minutes later, after we'd moved on to other things, my mind reaching for words that had already slipped further than I liked. I connected numbered dots on a page without lifting my pencil. I copied geometric shapes, some of them simple, some of them absurdly complicated, watching my own hand work slower than it once had. I named every animal I could think of in exactly 1 minute and ran out of new ones faster than I wanted to admit. Somewhere around the 40th minute of the session, I stopped thinking of it as a test and started thinking of it, oddly, as an accounting, the same slow, patient tallying I'd done for 4 decades over invoices and inventory, except this time, the ledger being balanced was my own mind. I sorted a deck of cards according to rules that changed without warning, and twice caught myself sorting by the old rule out of pure habit before correcting course. She asked about Elizabeth, about sleep, about whether I drank, what medications I took, whether I'd ever gotten lost driving somewhere familiar. Some of the questions were easy. Others made me feel every one of my 74 years in a way the morning's tide chart never had. At noon we broke for lunch, and Sophia and I sat in her car in the parking lot, splitting a sandwich neither of us finished. What if I fail? I asked her the question I'd been carrying since the drive up but hadn't let myself say out loud until then. She didn't offer me anything soft in return. Then we'd deal honestly with whatever the results show, she said. Angelo still planted that envelope. He still forged a filing date and rewrote a doctor's letter. A person can need help managing certain things and still know with complete clarity that he's being betrayed. Those 2 facts don't cancel each other out. She let that sit a moment before adding, softer than her usual courtroom register, and for what it's worth, Walker, I've represented a great many people in this county over 30 years. Very few of them could sit in a parking lot 4 days into something like this and ask the question you just asked me, instead of simply demanding I promise them a good outcome. I don't want to win this by pretending age can't touch a man. I know you don't. That's not what I'm asking you to pretend. She looked at me directly then, the way she had at my kitchen table 2 days earlier. Your hands are slower than they used to be. Names hover out of reach some mornings. You keep a paper calendar because it serves you better than the one on your phone. None of that has ever made you available for theft, Walker, and none of it will, no matter what today's results say. We finished the afternoon session a little past 3, and Dr. Orr called us back into her office an hour later, a folder open on the desk in front of her. The full written report will take a day to finalize, she said, But I can tell you the preliminary findings now, because I don't think you should carry uncertainty home with you tonight. I sat forward without meaning to. There's no evidence of dementia, no mild cognitive impairment, no deficit affecting your capacity for financial or personal judgment. Your processing speed is average for your age, which is entirely normal and not a marker of decline. Your verbal reasoning, if anything, is above average. She paused, letting that settle before continuing. You do show signs consistent with prolonged grief and disrupted sleep. Those deserve real attention and real care. They do not in any clinical sense justify guardianship. I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized had been wound tight for 3 days. Maybe longer. Maybe since a folder first landed on a kitchen island with the word temporary printed nowhere past its heading. On the drive home, the causeway unrolling ahead of us under a sky going gray at the edges, I watched the marsh pass by without really seeing it, turning the day over the way I'd turned over every document since Sunday. Faith Orr's findings didn't tell me what Angelo actually wanted, or why he'd needed my incompetence badly enough to forge 2 separate documents to manufacture it. They only told me with clean, clinical certainty that the question I'd been carrying since the platform, whether something might genuinely be slipping in my own mind, had never been the real question at all. I let myself feel that relief fully for perhaps a mile of causeway before the next question crowded in behind it, patient and unhurried, the way the truth always seemed to wait its turn these days, rather than announce itself all at once. The real question, I understood now, watching the last light fall gold across the water, was what my son was so afraid I'd discover, that he'd needed the whole town to believe I couldn't be trusted to see it. Isabel called Sophia's office Thursday morning, not mine, and asked that I be there too when they met. I understood the choice without needing it explained. She wanted a witness to whatever she was about to say, someone besides her husband's father. Someone who couldn't be dismissed later as taking a side out of blood alone. We met at the Skipjack Diner on the north end of the island, in a booth near the back where the vinyl seats had gone soft with 40 years of watermen sliding in after early mornings on the water. Isabel was already there when we arrived, still in the pale blue scrubs she wore for her shifts at the county clinic, a glass of iced tea sweating untouched in front of her. "Angelo thinks I'm working a double today," she said before either of us had fully sat down. "Are you afraid of him?" I asked because there didn't seem to be room left for smaller questions. She looked toward the window out at the workboats rocking gently against the dock pilings. "Not that he'd hit me. I've never once thought that. I'm afraid of what happens when he decides a person has become a problem standing between him and whatever he's decided he needs." Sophia slid into the booth beside me. "Tell us only what you know firsthand," she said. "Don't access anything on his devices. Don't remove documents that aren't yours. And don't put Scout in the middle of this any further than she already is." Isabel nodded and reached into a canvas tote bag at her feet, pulling out a manila folder soft at the corners from handling. "For months he's told me the company was in a temporary cash bind because of the peer negotiations dragging on. He cut his own salary on paper and asked me to cover more of our household expenses from what we'd saved. I didn't question it much. He's always been careful with money. Or I thought he was." "And in August?" Sophia asked. "In August, he withdrew $52,000 from Scout's college account, the one we started the year she was born. He told me it was a short-term loan to the company, that he'd put it back before anything came due." Her voice thinned on the last few words, the practiced steadiness of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation in her head more than once before finding the courage to have it out loud. I had known Isabel for 12 years. Since the spring Angelo brought her home for the first time, and she'd spent the whole dinner asking Elizabeth questions about the business, instead of making the small, polite conversation most new girlfriends offered. Elizabeth had liked her instantly for exactly that reason. The small, polite conversation most new girlfriends offered. Elizabeth had liked her instantly for exactly that reason. I asked him what the company needed it for specifically. He said it was going toward Union Point, a turnaround consultant protecting the business from a debt problem I didn't need to understand. He made me feel foolish for pressing further. "The transfer didn't go to the company," I said. It wasn't a question. No, I finally pulled the statement myself 2 nights ago. It went straight to Union Point Advisory Group, not to Murray Seafood Works at all. Sophia had already opened her own notebook. Did you authorize that withdrawal? The account requires both signatures, doesn't it? It does. That's my signature on the form, but I never signed it. She pushed a bank statement across the table, and I recognized Isabel's signature well enough from years of birthday cards and school forms to see immediately what she meant. The shape was close enough to pass a careless glance, but the final loop of the L in her name curved a direction she'd never once made it curve in 20 years of writing it. Why did you believe I was the one confused? I asked her. Why did you let him call the police on Sunday? Her face reddened, and for a moment I thought she might not answer at all. Because I saw the envelope come out of your coat pocket with my own eyes, and because believing my husband felt less frightening than believing he could do something like that to his own father. She looked up, meeting my eyes directly for the first time since we'd sat down. It was not an apology, but it was the truest thing she'd said all morning. What's changed? I asked. Scout's sentence on the platform. I watched his face when she said he'd carried the coat in himself. He told her afterward she was mistaken, that she needed to say so to the deputy. She wouldn't. Isabel wrapped both hands around her tea glass, though she still hadn't taken a drink of it. I've been sleeping in the spare room since Monday night. He hasn't asked why. I don't think he wants to know the answer badly enough to ask. Sophia photographed the bank statement and the withdrawal form with Isabel's written permission, then asked gently whether there was anything else connected to Union Point that Isabel had seen or heard. Isabel hesitated, glancing toward the window again, toward the boats, toward anything that wasn't our faces, waiting on her answer. There's a man, she finally said. Angelo's college roommate. He's been coming to the house late at night for weeks, and every time he leaves, Angelo looks less like my husband and more like someone I'm meeting for the first time. Do you have a name? Sophia asked. Bryson Ahmed. Angelo says they roomed together in college. I looked him up once out of curiosity more than suspicion back before any of this started. He runs some kind of real estate brokerage out of Salisbury. Sophia wrote the name down without comment, though I noticed her pen pause a half-second longer than it needed to before she moved to the next line. Sophia arranged the meeting for Friday morning before the guardianship hearing that afternoon at the Somerset County Community Bank branch 2 streets back from the harbor. I had known Amelia Larson since she was a teller in her 20s counting out my deposits by hand before the branch ever installed its first computer terminal. Elizabeth used to bring her a slice of pie from the diner every Friday for a full year after Amelia's mother passed, back when Amelia was barely 22 and grieving alone in a town that hadn't yet learned how to hold space for a young woman's loss the way it knew how to hold space for an old man's. Her hair had gone silver since then, and she now ran the commercial lending division with the same careful calm I remembered from those early years, only sharpened by 3 decades of watching businesses rise and fold across the county. Because you remain the personal guarantor and majority shareholder, Amelia said, once we were seated in her office with the door closed, I can discuss obligations carrying your name, even without Angelo present. I want to be clear that I called Sophia the moment I saw what I'm about to show you. She slid a printed statement across her desk. Angelo told me the revolving line was sitting around $380,000. That's the number he's given me verbally on 3 separate calls this year. And the actual figure? Sophia asked. $1,340,000. Amelia let that sit a moment before continuing. The increase came through in June, backed by a written consent supposedly signed by you, authorizing an additional draw of $960,000. I felt something cold settle behind my ribs, the same cold I'd felt reading the notarization date on the guardianship petition. I never signed anything like that. I didn't think you had, once Sophia explained what's been happening this week, but the signature on file matches your name typed beneath it, and to anyone glancing at it quickly, it would pass. Amelia turned the document toward me, and I studied the looping W at the start of my own name close enough to fool a stranger wrong enough that I knew immediately it wasn't mine. The pressure sat differently, My own hand had never once curved the tail of that letter the way this one did. 44 years of signing invoices, delivery slips, and payroll checks had worn a particular groove into how my hand moved across paper. A groove no forger, however careful, could fully imitate, without years of the same repetition behind it. The document also lists Union Point Advisory Group as an approved restructuring advisor on the account, Amelia continued, which explains something else I need to show you. She pulled a second page from the folder. There's a separate disbursement schedule connected to the pending sale of the pier property. It directs $680,000 of the expected proceeds to Union Point, described here as a success and settlement fee payable immediately upon closing.
Has the sale even been approved? Sophia asked, her pen already moving. We received a corporate secretary certificate stating all required approvals had been obtained. Closing is scheduled in escrow for early next week, subject only to release after shareholder ratification. Amelia's expression tightened slightly. Who signed that certificate? Eleazar Newton, I said before she could answer her own question because I already knew the name that would be there. Our controller appointed acting secretary, apparently at a board meeting I had never attended and never heard called. And the wire to Union Point, scheduled to fund at closing, Amelia said, meaning the money moves before your board ever formally votes to authorize the sale that's supposed to generate it. I sat back in my chair doing the arithmetic the only way I knew how, the way I'd done every hard number of my life, slowly and by hand, until it either balanced or didn't. If a probate judge granted Angelo control of my voting shares that afternoon, he could ratify the pier sale himself the following Monday. By then, more than $500,000 would already be sitting inside his college roommate's company, structured to look, on paper, like the price of saving a business that had never actually needed saving in the first place. Can you stop the wire? I asked. I can suspend any extraordinary disbursement connected to this transaction, Amelia said, because the authority behind it and the signature on file are both disputed. What I can't do is decide whether fraud occurred. That's not a bank's role. I'll need written notice from counsel and documentation of your current voting rights before I can act, but I can have both of those in place within the hour if Sophia's ready to provide them. I'm ready, Sophia said, already reaching for her phone. Amelia looked at me directly, then setting the folder flat on her desk between us. Walker, $600 from a child's fundraiser is not what built this file. That was never the real amount at stake. It was always the smallest, cheapest piece of something considerably larger, and I think by now you already understand that better than anyone in this room. I did. I had understood it in some unspoken way since the moment I'd watched Angelo's face on that platform choose calculation over confusion. What I hadn't fully understood until the number 1,340,000 sat printed in front of me in Amelia's careful black type was exactly how much of my son's certainty had been built entirely on the assumption that I would never look closely enough to find it. The Somerset County probate courtroom was smaller than I expected when Sophia and I walked in a little before 2 that afternoon. Dark wood and fluorescent light rows of benches worn smooth by generations of worried families who'd sat exactly where I was sitting now. There was no jury box, no marble, nothing, but a judge's bench, 2 counsel tables, and the particular hush that settles over a room built for deciding what happens to people rather than what happens to property. I had sat in rooms like it exactly twice before in my life. Once for Elizabeth's estate paperwork after her mother died, and once decades earlier to sign the county lease that first let Elizabeth and I open our doors as Murray Seafood Works. Both times I had walked out with more than I'd walked in with. I did not know yet, sitting there that afternoon, which way this particular room would send me home. Angelo sat at the opposite table with Parker Cortez beside him, both of them in dark suits that made them look more alike than I'd ever noticed before. Isabel sat 2 rows behind us, alone, close enough to hear, but far enough not to be seen as taking either side. Scout wasn't there. Sophia had insisted the child not be pulled into open court unless the judge decided her testimony was essential, and Deputy Santos's recorded interview, along with the authenticated photographs, would speak for her instead.
Judge Colleen Marsh entered at 2 exactly, a woman in her late 50s with the flat, unhurried expression of someone who had spent decades listening to families explain why control was actually love. She took her seat, reviewed the file for a long moment without looking up, then nodded for the proceedings to begin. Parker Cortez rose first, describing urgency in a voice smoother than I expected from a man whose handwriting had looked so unsteady on the page I'd read 4 days earlier. He cited my grief, my age, the alleged memory lapses, the reported theft, the need for immediate protective structure while a fuller evaluation proceeded. He called the notarization date a clerical error, nothing more, and argued the photographs showed only that Angelo had handled the coat, not that he'd planted anything inside it. Sophia rose when he finished, and she didn't raise her voice, didn't call Angelo cruel, didn't tell the judge what kind of father I'd tried to be for 47 years. Courts, she'd told me once at my kitchen table, weren't built to measure a lifetime in Sunday dinners and school concerts. She gave the judge records instead. She entered Dr. Orr's preliminary findings. First, full capacity, no deficit, grief and disrupted sleep, clearly distinguished from anything resembling incompetence. She entered Dr. Fry's statement, contradicting the altered letter, point by point. She entered the court's own electronic filing history, showing the notarized verification dated 2 full days before the alleged theft occurred. She entered Scout's time-lapse photographs, walking the judge frame by frame through 841 to 846, the empty shed, Angelo's arrival, the blue envelope disappearing into a coat that wasn't his to place anything inside. I watched Parker Cortez while Sophia spoke rather than watching the judge. He sat very still beside his client, one hand flat on a legal pad he hadn't written on in several minutes. His eyes moving across each exhibit as it was entered, with an attention that had stopped looking like advocacy and started looking unmistakably like a man reading something for the first time, alongside everyone else in the room. Once, when Sophia entered the notarization page itself, I saw his jaw tighten in a way that had nothing to do with courtroom performance. "Finally," Sophia said, laying the bank documents beside the photographs. The disputed consent authorizing a $960,000 increase to the company's credit line, alongside verified samples of Mr. Murray's actual signature, provided by Somerset County Community Bank this morning. She turned to face the bench directly. Mr. Murray isn't asking this court to resolve the underlying financial questions today. He's asking only that his son not be granted emergency authority over his life and his company through evidence that appears on its face to have been manufactured for that exact purpose. Judge Marsh looked up from the file for the first time since the hearing began, her gaze settling on Angelo rather than on either attorney. "Mr. Murray," she said, "did you place a blue envelope inside your father's coat on Sunday morning?" Parker Cortez's hand moved to his client's forearm before Angelo could answer, a small gesture restraining rather than reassuring. "My client invokes his right not to answer given the pending criminal referral," he said. "That's his right," Judge Marsh said, her voice giving away nothing. "It doesn't require this court to disregard the evidence already before it." She looked down at the stack of exhibits, then back up. And for a long moment, nobody in that small dark room said anything at all, the silence stretching. The particular way silence stretches right before a decision that will reshape more than one life at the same table. I found myself absurdly thinking of Elizabeth's brass name tag again, tucked away in its red tin on a shelf a half-hour's drive from where I now sat, and wondering what she would have made of a courtroom deciding on the strength of a seedling camera and a wrong-shaped letter L, whether our son had traded everything we'd built for a debt he'd never once had the courage to name out loud. Before Judge Marsh spoke again, Parker Cortez rose from his chair unbidden and asked to address the court briefly outside the presence of the ruling itself. "Your Honor, I'd request a short recess to confer with my client regarding the scope of today's arguments." Judge Marsh studied him for a moment. "You have 5 minutes, Mr. Cortez." He and Angelo stepped into the hallway, and through the courtroom's narrow window, I watched them stand close together. Parker's posture rigid, one hand gesturing toward the folder of exhibits still resting on our table, as though the paper itself had become the subject of the argument. Angelo's face had gone the color of old rope. Whatever passed between them lasted closer to 8 minutes than 5, and when they returned, Parker Cortez sat down without looking at his client and did not immediately rise again when the judge asked if he wished to add anything further.
"Mr. Cortez," Judge Marsh prompted. He stood slowly.
Your Honor, in light of the documentary evidence presented, I'm withdrawing the portion of my argument characterizing the notarization discrepancy as a clerical matter. I don't have an alternative explanation to offer the court at this time, and I won't stand behind a characterization I can no longer support in good conscience.
A small sound moved through the room, not quite a gasp, more the collective intake of breath a courtroom makes when it senses the floor has shifted beneath one side of the argument. Angelo stared straight ahead, jaw set, refusing to look at either his attorney or me. Judge Marsh made a note unhurried, then closed the file in front of her.
I've reviewed the petition, the responsive evidence, and the arguments presented by both counsel, she said. The petition for emergency guardianship is denied. Mr. Murray retains full control of his property, his finances, and his voting interests in Murray Seafood Works, effective immediately. She looked toward the clerk. I'm also directing that all filings in this matter be preserved in their original electronic form, and the copies of the disputed medical letter and notarized verification be forwarded to the county prosecutor's office for review. The gavel didn't come down, not the way it does in the courtroom dramas Elizabeth used to watch on Sunday afternoons. Judge Marsh simply rose, and the bailiff called the room to its feet, and it was over. 4 days of forged dates and rebuilt letters and photographed pockets of light settled in less time than it took most families to argue about where to eat dinner. Outside on the courthouse steps, 2 reporters were waiting with cameras already raised, tipped off, I suspected, by whoever in the clerk's office had recognized the name Murray Seafood Works attached to a competency filing. I could have told them everything standing right there, the forged consent, the altered letter, the wire scheduled to fund, before any lawful vote authorized it. Part of me wanted to. Instead, I gave them one sentence. The court confirmed today that I remain fully capable of managing my own affairs. Our company's employees and customers deserve accurate information, and an independent financial review will provide it in the coming weeks. I won't be discussing my family further. Then I walked past them toward Sophia's car. Isabel a few steps behind us, none of us speaking, until the courthouse had shrunk in the side mirror to something small enough to look almost ordinary again. He withdrew the argument, I said finally once we were on the road. Cortez. He did. Sophia kept both hands on the wheel, her eyes on the causeway ahead. That's not nothing, Walker. An attorney doesn't stand up in open court and abandon a position unless he's genuinely lost confidence in his client's account of events. Whatever Angelo told him in that hallway, it wasn't enough to hold the line. You think Cortez suspects there's more? I think Cortez just watched 8 minutes of private conversation convince him he'd rather protect his own credibility than keep defending a story that's already come apart twice in 1 week. Attorneys notice that pattern eventually. Most of them would rather withdraw a claim than build an entire case on top of a foundation they no longer trust. I thought of Parker's rigid posture through that hallway window, the way he hadn't looked at Angelo when he sat back down, and understood with a clarity that felt almost like grief itself that my son had just watched one more person quietly stop believing him. It was not a satisfaction I had expected to feel. I had spent 6 days gathering the pieces of a case against my own son, with the same methodical patience I once brought to a supplier dispute, and only now, watching a stranger in a courthouse hallway lose faith in him before I ever raised my voice to do the same, did I understand how much of that patience had been grief wearing the clothes of diligence. What happens now? Isabel asked from the back seat, her voice smaller than it had been at the diner 2 days earlier. Now the criminal referral moves forward on its own track, Sophia said. And the civil side of this, the money, the credit line, the wire that never should have been scheduled, becomes something the company has to address directly, which means, Walker, you have a board meeting to call. Tomorrow, if you're ready for it. I looked out at the marsh grass running gold along the causeway, thinking of 91 people whose paychecks had nothing to do with any of this and everything to do with whether I moved quickly enough now to protect it. "I'm ready," I said. The board met Saturday morning in the conference room above the packing house, the same room where Elizabeth and I had once argued for 2 hours over whether to add a second processing line, back when every decision still felt small enough to survive a raised voice or two. Murray Seafood Works had 5 directors. Angelo and I held 2 seats. Millen Jones, Elizabeth's younger sister, held a third. The remaining 2 belonged to Ander Jarvis, a retired county bank president who'd known Elizabeth since grade school, and Jenna Rowland, who ran a regional seafood distribution company 2 counties over and had joined our board 4 years earlier at Elizabeth's own recommendation. All 4 had received some version of Angelo's story over the past week, whether directly or through the current running through the town's smaller channels, the diner counter, the dock gossip, the church parking lot after Sunday service. I arrived early and stood at the window overlooking the packing floor below, watching the morning crew work the culling tables the way they had every Saturday for as long as I could remember. Elizabeth's hand-painted signs still hung above the first row of coolers, imperfect lettering I'd refused every suggestion to replace over the years. Fresh catch, ice daily, family owned since the year printed too small now for most people to read without stepping close. I had resisted replacing those signs through 3 different marketing consultants over the years, each one certain that professional signage would move more product. Elizabeth had painted them herself the winter we opened, standing on a step stool in a coat 2 sizes too big for her, and I had never once been able to look at fresh vinyl lettering and feel the same thing those crooked letters still made me feel. At 9, Angelo entered, with Parker Cortez trailing a half step behind him, and set his briefcase down at the head of the table without hesitation. "That's the chairman's seat," I said. He looked at me for a long moment, something calculating still moving behind his eyes even now, and then shifted 1 chair to the left without argument. I didn't open with the coat or the platform or any of the week's accusations. I opened with cash. Payroll would clear Thursday as scheduled. Beyond that, without vendor cooperation and a revised bank agreement, the company faced a serious shortfall within weeks. I laid out the real credit line balance, the disputed $960,000 consent, the Union Point payments totaling $792,000, and the disbursement schedule directing money to that same company before any lawful vote had authorized the sale generating it. Angelo objected to nearly every page as I presented it. He called the figures preliminary, said Eliezer was covering gaps in his own record-keeping, insisted Union Point had performed valuable strategic work that couldn't be reduced to a simple invoice line. I let him talk. 44 years of running this company had taught me that a weak argument rarely improves with more air behind it. It only shows its shape more clearly the longer it's allowed to run. When Jenna asked him to produce a single completed report from 18 months of consulting, he promised to have one to the board by the following week. "You've had 18 months, Jenna said. "I'm not giving you another week." Ander leaned forward, his voice carrying the particular calm of a man who'd spent 4 decades reading loan applications for a living. "Did Walker sign the consent authorizing the credit line increase?" Angelo glanced toward Parker before answering. "On advice of counsel, I'm not discussing disputed signatures while a criminal referral is pending." "Then did this board ever approve that increase?" Ander asked. The company needed liquidity to protect the peer negotiations. "Liquidity for what specifically?" Ander pressed. "I've underwritten enough deals in this county to know the difference between liquidity and a man buying himself room to maneuver." Angelo didn't answer that directly either. He looked instead toward Parker Cortez, the same reflex he'd shown twice now in the last 2 days, reaching for support from a man who had already made clear in a courthouse hallway how little of it remained to give. Angelo pushed back slightly from the table, color rising in his face for the first time that morning. "You're all letting one difficult week destroy a transaction that could save this company's future." Milan, who had said almost nothing since the meeting began, finally spoke, her voice quiet but carrying easily across the room. The petition you filed asked a court for control of your father's voting shares. That makes what happened this week company business, whether you'd like it to be or not.
This meeting is about the pier sale, Angelo said. Not about a family disagreement you're all treating like a corporate emergency.
Your family disagreement, Jenna said, came with a forged bank consent and a fabricated medical letter attached to it. I don't know what you'd call that, Angelo, but around this table, we call it exactly what it looks like.
Parker Cortez shifted in his seat but said nothing, his earlier withdrawal from the courtroom argument apparently extending at least for now to silence in this room as well. Angelo looked at his attorney as if expecting support that didn't come, then looked back at the table at four faces that had stopped somewhere in the last 20 minutes treating his explanations as anything other than a formality to be endured before the vote. Everyone in the room already understood was coming. Angelo let the silence stretch a moment longer, then straightened in his chair, and something in his posture shifted, the calculating look I'd watched cross his face at the head of the table, returning sharper now, aimed somewhere new. I recognized it from the platform 4 days earlier, the same expression he'd worn in the half-second before deciding which version of events might still be salvaged. "If we're talking about who's responsible for what's on those pages," he said, "you should be asking Eliezer these questions directly, not me. I approve invoice totals that cross my desk. I don't personally verify every vendor's underlying paperwork." Eliezer signed the secretary's certificate claiming full board approval for the pier sale. That certificate is false. I never told him to file it. If anyone manufactured authority they didn't have, it's your controller, not your son. The room went quiet, in a different way than it had a moment earlier. Less anticipation, now more the particular unease of people recalculating who else in the building might deserve suspicion. Jenna glanced toward me. Anders' expression had gone carefully neutral, the look of a man who'd heard 100 deflections in his banking career and was mentally filing this one alongside the rest. "Eliezer's been our controller for 9 years, I said. "He's never once given this company a reason to doubt him before this week. People change, Dad. Pressure changes people. Maybe he panicked. Maybe he thought he was helping. Maybe he's been skimming something on his own and using my name to cover it. I don't know. What I know is that certificate has his signature on it, not mine, authorizing a certification he had no board vote to support." Milan spoke before I could. "Do you have any evidence Eliezer acted independently, Angelo, anything at all, beyond the signature itself?" "I have the certificate." "That's not evidence of independent action," Anders said. "That's evidence someone signed a document. It doesn't tell us who directed him to." "I'd like to call Eliezer in," Jenna said, already reaching for her phone. "Right now, before we go any further with accusations either direction." Eliezer arrived within 20 minutes, pale, his tie slightly crooked in a way I'd never once seen on him in 9 years of Saturday meetings. He confirmed he'd signed the certificate. He confirmed haltingly that Angelo had told him a board vote had occurred the previous month, a meeting Eliezer himself hadn't attended, and that he'd trusted the representation rather than independently verifying it against the minutes. "Show me the minutes from that meeting," Anders said. There were none. No meeting had been called, no notice sent, no quorum gathered. Eliezer's face, already pale, went a shade paler as the room's silence made clear what that absence meant for the story he'd been asked to believe. "I should have checked," Eliezer said quietly. "I know that now. But I didn't sign that certificate to protect myself or to hide anything of my own. I signed it because Angelo told me it was already approved, and I didn't think to question a man I'd worked beside for 9 years. Angelo said nothing. Whatever calculation had brought him to blame Eliezer in the first place had clearly not accounted for a controller willing to admit fault openly rather than let the accusation stand unanswered. "I move we suspend Angelo as president, with pay, pending the outcome of an independent forensic review," Jenna said, not waiting for further discussion. Her voice carried the flat efficiency of someone who had run difficult meetings before and had no intention of letting this one drift into another hour of circular argument. "Second, we retain an outside accounting firm immediately to trace every dollar connected to Union Point Advisory Group and the disputed credit line. Third,
We appoint an interim president to manage operations during the review.
I'll second that, Anders said. The vote came quickly. After that 4 in favor, Angelo alone opposed, his vote carrying no more weight against the others than any single share among many. Milan moved to appoint Jenna interim president, given her distribution background and her clean distance from anything connected to Union Point. That motion passed as well. Angelo closed his briefcase slowly, the same deliberate motion he'd used to open it 3 hours earlier, and I watched something leave his face that I couldn't quite name. Not defeat exactly, something closer to a man recalculating a story that had finally run out of new directions to bend. "You think a 4-to-1 vote makes you right?" he said, looking at me rather than at the board. "No," I said. "The forensic review will decide what's right. But when this company survives, every person on that packing floor downstairs will know exactly who tried to gamble it away and exactly who stopped him." He left his building key on the table without being asked, and security disabled his access badge before he'd even reached the stairwell. A request Jenna made calmly into her phone, as though revoking a company president's authority were simply one more line item on a very long morning's agenda. I had imagined that moment more than once during the sleepless hours of the past week. I had expected somewhere beneath the exhaustion to feel something like relief when it finally came. I felt only the particular ache of remembering the first key I'd ever given him, 16 years old, proud enough to arrive 20 minutes early every Saturday just to have the coffee ready before the crew came in. No parent raises a child expecting to one day sit at a table and vote him out of the very room he once helped build with his own eager, careful hands. Jolie Bradford arrived at the packing house 11 days later, a small woman in her 60s with close-cropped white hair and the unnerving habit of letting silence sit in a room until someone else felt compelled to fill it. Elizabeth used to say the best auditors were the ones who could outwait anybody. Jolie proved that reputation within the first 10 minutes of the meeting, saying almost nothing while Jenna and I settled into our chairs, letting the quiet do whatever work it needed to do before she opened her laptop. Her team had spent those 11 days imaging company servers, reconciling 18 months of transactions, and tracing every dollar that had ever touched an account labeled Union Point Advisory Group. What she laid out on the screen that afternoon was cleaner and colder than anything I'd imagined during the sleepless stretch of nights since the platform. Of the $792,000 paid to Union Point over 18 months, she said, I can document legitimate consulting services worth generously $28,000. A handful of market reports, mostly copied from publicly available county development studies, with minor formatting changes. "And the rest?" Jenna asked. "The rest moved through Union Point and out again almost immediately in most cases to other destinations." Jolie brought up a diagram, boxes and arrows tracing money the way I once traced fish stock through a supply chain. Except this particular chain led somewhere far uglier than a dinner plate. $312,000 went to an entity called Anchor Cove Holdings, which company records show is wholly owned by Angelo. I sat very still, listening. $240,000 serviced interest and penalty payments on a private real estate loan personally guaranteed by Angelo and a second individual. $180,000 purchased deposits on several land parcels adjacent to the pier property parcels that never became part of the company's holdings and don't appear on any Murray Seafood Works balance sheet. The remainder covered legal fees, travel expenses, and additional interest charges unrelated to any consulting work I can identify. "A private real estate loan," I repeated. "For what?" That's not entirely clear from our records alone, though the pattern is familiar enough. It appears Angelo and his partner were attempting to quietly assemble several adjoining parcels near the pier, likely intending to sell the combined property to the resort group at a considerably higher price than any individual owner would have accepted for their piece alone. When at least 2 property owners refused to sell, the assembly effort collapsed and the private lender behind it began demanding repayment on a loan that was never going to generate the return it was taken out to chase. Jenna leaned back in her chair, So the company's money went to bail out a private land deal that had nothing to do with the company. That's what the numbers show, Jolie said. Company funds disguised as consulting fees used to service private obligations, while the actual business absorbed both the expense and the risk. I want to be careful here because tracing money is not the same as proving intent. And intent will matter enormously if this proceeds to criminal charges. But the pattern is not ambiguous. $28,000 of value against $792,000 of expense is not a rounding error. It's a structure. I thought of the two men in pressed shirts standing on the dock the morning of the blessing, watching a platform they'd likely been invited to as much as any fisherman's family had been. I thought of Angelo's voice on the phone that first Sunday night warning me about a debt problem I didn't even know existed. Yet the one true sentence buried inside an hour of deflection. Can any of it be recovered? I asked. Some. Union Point currently holds roughly $140,000 in accounts we've already moved to freeze through the bank. Anchor Cove owns a condominium in Ocean City and a partial interest in two of those unsold parcels, both of which have real value that a court could order liquidated. Full recovery depends on several things outside my control. Court orders, lender priority, whatever insurance coverage applies, and ultimately the criminal case. I'd caution you against budgeting for all of it. I wasn't planning to, I said, and meant it. Money recovered wouldn't undo a forged bank consent, or a rewritten doctor's letter, or a 13-year-old girl learning on the morning of a town's oldest ceremony that her own father had used her fundraiser envelope as a prop in something considerably larger than either of them. Jolie closed her laptop and looked at me directly the first time all afternoon she'd offered anything beyond numbers. For what it's worth, Mr. Murray, I've done this work for over 20 years. Most of the fraud I trace is built to look complicated so nobody bothers untangling it. Yours wasn't especially complicated. It was built to look boring instead. Buried in a category of expense nobody questions closely because consulting fees rarely make for interesting reading. That's usually the more dangerous kind. It survives longer precisely because it's not designed to draw attention. It's designed to be skimmed past. I thanked her, and Jenna walked her down to the parking lot, and I sat alone in the conference room for a while afterward, with the diagrams still glowing on the laptop screen, boxes and arrows tracing the shape of a sun I was still 11 days after a board vote, having trouble reconciling with the boy who used to ride beside me on delivery runs, naming every boat we passed by its registration number, just to see if he could beat me to it. I thought about that on the drive home past the crepe myrtles, past the empty chair waiting at my own kitchen table, and understood that the $600 in a granddaughter's fundraiser envelope had never been the crime at all. It had only ever been the one detail, small enough and specific enough to finally get somebody looking closely. Sophia filed a civil action on the company's behalf within days of Jolie's report, seeking an accounting and the return of whatever funds could still be traced. And the court issued a temporary order freezing what remained in Union Point's accounts before any of it could move again. Bryson Ahmed hired his own attorney within 48 hours of being served. And by the following Tuesday, his lawyer had reached out to Sophia's office, offering full cooperation. We met in Sophia's conference room on a gray Tuesday afternoon, rain streaking the windows in slow diagonal lines. Bryson Ahmed had been the loud, easy young man who used to sleep on our living room couch during college holidays, calling Elizabeth's dressing crab the best food he'd ever eaten in his life, laughing too hard at his own jokes at our kitchen table until Elizabeth threatened fondly to charge him rent. At 46, he wore a suit that fit him a size too well and carried the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent years running just ahead of a bill he could no longer outpace. His attorney did most of the talking. Union Point had transferred $312,000 to Anchor Cove Holdings, confirming exactly what Jolie's audit had already shown. Another $240,000 had serviced interest and penalties on a private loan Angelo and Bryson had personally guaranteed together, taken out to fund the quiet assembly of parcels adjacent to the pier. The remaining $180,000 had gone toward deposits on land Angelo and Bryson had hoped to combine and resell to the resort group at a considerable markup once the pier sale went through.
When two of the property owners refused to sell, the whole arrangement had collapsed, and the private lender had begun demanding repayment on a debt that had never had any legitimate path to being paid back.
"Why the consulting structure at all?" I asked. "Why not just borrow the money honestly and repay it honestly?" Bryson's lawyer answered before he could. The credit line increase and the disbursement schedule would have covered the remaining private obligation entirely, structured to look on paper like a legitimate business expense my client's company had earned. "For taking on the risk," Bryson said quietly, the first time he'd spoken directly since sitting down. I looked at him. "You took company money that belonged to 91 people's paychecks and called that your risk to be compensated for?" He rubbed one hand across his face, slow tired. "Angelo told me the pier sale was inevitable. He said you were sentimental about the property, that he could get around you eventually, that it was only a matter of timing."
Did he tell you how?
Bryson's eyes flicked toward his attorney, who gave him a small, reluctant nod. "Not at first. Later, yes." "When was later?" "He said he was documenting concerns about your memory. Building a record, he called it. He said once he had control of the voting shares, he could approve everything through the board himself, and nobody would question the consulting fee closely enough to unravel it." Sophia leaned forward slightly. "Did he ever mention Scout or the fundraiser envelope specifically?" The room went very quiet. Bryson's attorney whispered something to him I couldn't hear, and Bryson nodded once before answering. "3 days before it happened," he said. "He called me Thursday night, said the guardianship filing needed something concrete to point to, something that would make the whole thing feel urgent instead of theoretical. He said there'd be a family incident strong enough for a judge to take seriously fast." Those were his words, a family incident. Close to it. I didn't ask what he meant specifically. I told myself I didn't want to know, which I understand now wasn't the same as not knowing. I sat with that for a long moment, the rain still tracing its slow lines down the window glass. $600 chosen with enough precision that it would sound serious without inviting a serious investigation, small enough that a family might handle it quietly, specific enough that a 13-year-old's name could carry the weight an abstract accusation never would have carried on its own. It had never been a moment of panic on a Sunday morning. It had been a line item, planned 3 days in advance in a scheme that had already moved nearly $2 million through a company neither Eliezer nor I had ever been meant to understand. Bryson signed a sworn statement before he left and provided Union Point's banking records in exchange for the company's agreement to consider his cooperation when resolving the civil claim. Nobody promised him protection from whatever criminal exposure remained. That decision belonged to the prosecutor, not to us. At the door, he stopped his hand on the frame, not quite looking back at me. "I'm sorry, Walker. For what it's worth, which I know isn't much anymore." "It's worth something," I said, because it was true, even if it wasn't enough. "Not for what you took, for finally saying it out loud." He left without answering that, and Sophia closed the door behind him, and for a while, neither of us said anything at all, the rain still falling steadily outside, the way it does over water that has already seen every kind of storm a person can name, and simply keeps moving regardless. I thought of Scout, safe for now at her mother's sister's house across the county line, and hoped, without much confidence, that by the time she was old enough to hear the full shape of what her father's old friend had just confessed, some of the anger in it might have softened into something closer to understanding, the way most hard things eventually do, given enough tide. The shareholder meeting convened 5 weeks after the platform held after closing hours in the old packing warehouse because the conference room upstairs couldn't hold everyone who needed to be there. Folding chairs filled the concrete floor in uneven rows. Family shareholders sat toward the front. Line workers and dock crew stood along the back wall in their work clothes, some still smelling faintly of the day's catch, having stayed late on their own time, because Jenna had told them plainly, weeks earlier, that they had a right to hear this directly, rather than through the diner counter or the church parking lot. Angelo had the right to attend as a shareholder and director, unless formally removed by vote,
And he exercised it, arriving with Parker Cortez and taking a seat alone in the front row, rather than beside anyone from the family. I hadn't seen him since the board meeting that suspended him. He looked thinner. Gray had come into his hair at the temples in a way I hadn't noticed before, or hadn't let myself notice, and for one dangerous second, I remembered only the boy who used to arrive 20 minutes early on Saturdays, with the coffee already brewing before the crew walked in. Grief has a way of doing that, softening even the sharpest recent memory into something gentler than it has any right to be if a man lets his guard down for even a second. Jolie spoke first, laying out the audit findings for the room the same way she'd laid them out for the board, unhurried, methodical, letting the numbers carry whatever weight they needed to carry without dressing them in language they didn't require. She traced the union point payments from the first invoice to the final wire, showed the disputed consent beside verified samples of my actual signature, displayed the secret disbursement schedule that would have moved money before any lawful vote authorized it. When she finished, I stood, because some things needed to be said by the person who'd lived them rather than only shown on a screen. I stepped back from this company after Elizabeth died, I said, more than I should have. I wanted Angelo to succeed, and I wanted relief from decisions that reminded me every day she was gone. When the explanations grew polished and the reports grew thin, I accepted them longer than a chairman should have. My grief did not make me incompetent, it made me absent. This board and everyone in this room has a right to hold me accountable for that absence. Nobody moved. I looked toward the back wall toward Tasha Green at the paint counter and the crew who'd worked the culling table since before Angelo could walk, and continued. But my failure to look sooner didn't authorize anyone to forge my signature. It didn't turn company money into private money, and it didn't put an envelope in my coat. Angelo's face had gone very still, the same stillness I remembered from the courthouse hallway, a man calculating which version of the room might still be salvageable. Before he could speak, Isabel stood from her chair near the aisle, 3 rows back from where I stood. "I have something to say too," she said, and her voice, though quiet, carried easily in the warehouse's high concrete space. Angelo turned toward her, surprise, moving across his face for the first time all evening, genuine and unguarded in a way none of his other expressions had been. "I'm filing for separation," Isabel said. "I wanted this room to hear it from me, not through the diner counter either." She looked at Angelo directly. "You didn't just lie to your father. You made me a witness who stayed quiet, and you made our daughter carry the weight of a lie you built and then asked her to protect." A sound moved through the warehouse, not quite a gasp, something closer to the collective shifting of 200 people recalculating all at once exactly how far this had gone. Angelo's hand went briefly to the back of his neck, a gesture I hadn't seen from him since he was small enough to be caught in an obvious lie and hadn't yet learned to hide the reflex. "Isabel?" he said, and it was the first time all evening his voice had cracked open into something unrehearsed. "You have no idea what I'm capable of when I finally stop being afraid of you," she said, and sat back down, her hands folded tightly in her lap, not looking at him again. Angelo stood slowly, and for a moment I thought he might walk out the way he'd walked out of rooms his entire adult life whenever the conversation stopped bending in his favor. Instead, he stayed standing, facing the room, rather than any single person in it. "I was drowning," he said, quiet enough that the back rows leaned forward to hear it. The land assembly the lone Bryson and I couldn't cover. Every year I watched this town compare me to my parents, the store owner who remembered every child's birthday, the woman who made kindness look like a business strategy. I told myself one bold decision would finally make this company mine instead of theirs. He looked at me then, and something in his face for just that moment resembled the boy in the porch lamp memory more than the man who'd built 4 documents to hide from that boy's failures. "I know that doesn't undo any of it." "No," I said, "it doesn't." Jenna rose and moved toward the front of the room, a single sheet of paper in her hand, and the warehouse went quiet again in the particular way it does right before a vote nobody in the room needed explained to them anymore.
Jenna read the motion aloud, plain and unadorned, exactly as she drafted it with Sophia the night before. To remove Angelo Murray from the board of directors for cause, terminate his employment with the company effective immediately, and authorize counsel to pursue all available civil claims to recover misappropriated funds. "All in favor?" Jenna said. Hands rose across the warehouse floor. Family shareholders first, then the smaller holdings represented by proxy until the count left almost no doubt before Jenna even finished tallying it aloud. Every share opposed the motion was Angelo's own. "The motion carries," Jenna said, and there was no gavel in that room, no ceremony beyond her voice and the particular stillness that follows a vote. Everyone already understood before it was called. Angelo didn't argue. He didn't stand and appeal to the room the way he had in the board meeting weeks earlier. He simply sat for a moment, both hands flat on his knees, looking at some point on the concrete floor that wasn't any of our faces, and then rose, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the door without looking back at Isabel or at me. I followed him out, not because I had anything left to say that hadn't already been said in some form over the past 5 weeks, but because some habits outlast the reasons a person built them. A father walks his son to the door even after the door has stopped leading anywhere good. He stopped on the loading dock outside, the evening air thick with the smell of low-tide gulls settling for the night along the pilings below us. "Do you need a ride somewhere?" I asked, and regretted it almost before the words finished leaving my mouth, an ordinary father's question landing in a place that no longer had room for ordinary things between us. "You voted the company out from under me, and now you're offering me a ride home," he said, not quite bitter, closer to exhausted. "I offered because I still care what happens to you. That isn't the same as undoing tonight. You chose the company, 91 strangers over your own son. I chose 91 families who trusted this company with their paychecks over a scheme that would have cost every one of them their livelihood to cover a debt you never had the courage to name honestly to me or to Isabel or to yourself. I kept my voice even, the same evenness I'd learned to hold since the morning on the platform, because raising it now would only give him one more story to tell himself about who had wronged whom. You made those choices necessary, Angelo, not me." He looked past me toward the warehouse lights still burning behind us, toward the shape of a building his own parents had started in a rented cinder-block shed before he'd been born. "I know," he said, quiet enough that I almost missed it beneath the sound of the tide. It was the first time in 5 weeks he'd said those 2 words without a qualifier trailing behind them. "Your attorney's waiting," I said, and Angelo simply nodded, once turned and walked toward the parking lot, where Parker Cortez stood beside an idling car, its headlights cutting twin pale lines across the gravel. I stood on the dock a while longer after he'd gone, listening to the warehouse slowly empty behind me. Footsteps and low voices, and the occasional creak of the old wooden door as families filed out into the evening. Isabel found me there eventually, Scout's absence a quiet ache neither of us mentioned directly, since she'd stayed with her aunt across the county line rather than sit through a room deciding her father's fate in person. "He said he knew," I told her. "He's said a lot of things this month," Isabel said, not unkindly, just tired in a way that had settled into her voice over 5 long weeks. I stopped keeping score of which ones were true somewhere around the second forged signature. I understood that. I had stopped keeping score myself somewhere between the notarization date and the number 1,340,000, not because the truth stopped mattering, but because a man could only carry so much careful accounting before the weight of it started to matter less than simply setting one foot in front of the other toward whatever came next. The local paper ran the story 2 mornings later, the audit findings laid out plainly beside a quote from Jenna about the board's commitment to transparency going forward. It didn't use Scout's name. Sophia had made certain of that, weeks earlier, one small mercy in a season that hadn't offered many. Some people who'd repeated Angelo's version of events in the diner or at the dock called afterward to apologize, awkward and half-formed apologies that I accepted without asking anyone to feel worse than they already did. Others said nothing at all,
and I learned slowly not to go looking for regret in rooms where it clearly hadn't arrived yet. Payroll cleared that Thursday, same as every Thursday before it. The crew worked the culling tables the way they always had, ice and salt and the particular rhythm of hands that had done the same motion 10,000 times before. Murray Seafood Works would survive, though not the way it had existed a month earlier, and not, I understood now, in a shape either Elizabeth or I could have fully recognized as the business we'd built from a rented shed 44 years before. It would survive, change the way most things worth keeping eventually are. The grand jury heard the case in December. Angelo was indicted on charges of theft, forgery, tampering with records, and filing a false police report. Bryson faced separate charges tied to the fraudulent transfers. Eliezer, whose cooperation the prosecutor had noted formally in the file, was charged only with falsifying the secretary's certificate, a lesser count that came with the understanding his early honesty would weigh in his favor at sentencing. Angelo surrendered through Parker Cortez, no sirens, no cameras, waiting on his lawn. He walked through a side door of the county detention center one gray morning, was processed, and appeared before a judge by video link that same afternoon. He posted bond, secured against what remained of his interest in Anchor Cove Holdings, once its condominium had been valued and the court had approved a partial release. The local station used old footage of him cutting a ribbon at a community fundraiser 2 years earlier. I was visible in the background of that clip, clapping along with everyone else, a version of our family that no longer existed anywhere but on tape. I turned the television off before the segment ended, unable to watch a version of that morning that had nothing to do with what had actually happened between us since. In January, Angelo's attorney requested a meeting with a mediator present. The prosecutor had offered a plea agreement if Angelo accepted responsibility, surrendered his remaining interest in Anchor Cove, and assisted in recovering whatever funds could still be traced. The state would recommend a sentence well below the maximum. If he went to trial instead, everything Jolie and Bryson and the notarization date had already made plain would be presented publicly at far greater length and far greater cost to everyone involved, including Scout. Angelo wore a plain gray sweater to that meeting instead of a suit, and looked without the armor of tailored fabric both younger and more tired than I'd seen him look in years. For a moment before either of us spoke, I saw something of the boy who used to fall asleep in the truck on the drive home from delivery runs, small enough still that I'd carry him inside without waking him. That boy had never once needed to be forgiven for anything larger than a broken lamp. Could the settlement characterize the Union Point payments as unauthorized loans, he asked, rather than theft? I intended to repay it eventually once the land deal closed. Did you? I asked. The pier sale would have covered the private debt eventually. That's not repayment, I said. That's hoping the next transaction quietly buries the last one. He didn't argue the point. Something in him seemed to have stopped fighting for the softer words somewhere between the warehouse floor and this small conference room. And when the mediator asked whether I would speak on his behalf if a judge asked for context, I told them both the truth as I understood it. I would say he'd worked hard for 20 years. I would say he'd helped grow this company past anything Elizabeth and I could have built alone. I would also say he'd forged a bank consent, rewritten a doctor's letter, and put a blue envelope in his own father's coat to frighten a 13-year-old into doubting what she'd seen with her own eyes. I would not ask for mercy. I would not ask for cruelty either. He accepted the plea 2 weeks later. At the hearing, he admitted under oath to each element of the scheme, his voice breaking only once when the prosecutor asked why he'd chosen $600 specifically. Because I thought it was enough to sound serious, he said, and small enough that nobody would look at it closely. The court sentenced him to 3 years with the possibility of earlier release under state guidelines governing cooperation and restitution. When they led him from the courtroom, he looked back once. I raised my hand, not a wave exactly, not forgiveness performed for whoever might have been watching, only a sign that I had seen him, that I would keep seeing him, whatever came next. Scout didn't attend the sentencing. She'd been staying with her aunt through most of the winter, coming home to Isabel's new apartment on weekends, slowly rebuilding a version of ordinary life around a seedling rack she'd set up again beneath a different window. Angelo wrote her letters through a court-approved family counselor, careful ones at first, full of qualifiers and half-apologies. She returned unopened, the counselor reading each one aloud only far enough for Scout to hear whether it contained an actual admission or another excuse dressed as one. In March, she finally answered, not with a letter of her own, but with a photograph taken on her phone of a small brass plate outside the county music office, the first receipt from a modest fund she'd started using the recovered fundraiser cash, providing instrument repairs for students whose families couldn't otherwise afford them. On the back, in her own handwriting, she'd written a single sentence before mailing it to the address the counselor had given her. "I'm not ready to see you, but I hope you keep telling the truth." I drove her to the post office myself the morning she sent it, and stood beside her at the counter while she slid the envelope into the outgoing slot with both hands, the way a person closes something carefully rather than slams it shut. "Do you think he'll change?" she asked, once we were back in the truck. "I don't know," I told her, because it was the only honest answer left available to either of us that spring. She nodded the way a person nods at an answer they already expected but needed spoken aloud anyway, and looked out at the marsh grass moving past the window, green again after a long winter, patient in the particular way marsh grass has always been about waiting for whatever season comes next. The following summer, on the morning of the blessing of the fleet, I took the charcoal coat out of the closet where it had hung untouched since the platform. One brass button had come loose sometime over the winter. I carried it into the small room where Elizabeth's sewing machine still stood beneath the window, found matching thread in her old tin, and mended it the way she'd once shown me. Then I put it on and walked down to the dock where the boats waited, ribbons lifting in the same easy wind as always. I used to believe that stepping back, staying quiet, keeping the peace was the same as protecting the people I loved. I understand now that peace built on things left unexamined isn't peace at all. It's only a debt gathering interest in the dark until someone finally asks to see the books. Love that refuses to look closely isn't gentler than love that does. It's only slower to notice when something has already gone wrong. I think of families sometimes the way I think of the tide, always moving, never quite returning to the exact shape it held before. Some mornings God gives us calm water and we mistake it for permanence. Some mornings He gives us a storm specific enough to show us what was already cracked beneath the surface. And some mornings, if we're fortunate, He gives us a granddaughter brave enough to say what she saw, even when the whole dock was listening. What I carried away from that year wasn't triumph. It was something quieter than that, and harder won. The understanding that love and truth were never supposed to be opposites, only two hands doing the same difficult work. If you were standing where I stood that morning, coat in hand, a document on the counter, asking you to look away from your own family for 90 days of quiet, would you have signed it? Or would you have asked, the way I finally did, for the one thing peace can never actually give you? Proof. I'd like to hear which one you'd choose and why in the comments below. And if this story found something true in your own